Good afternoon, thanks for coming. My name is Nir. I am the director of the Applied Ethics Center here at UMass Boston. And this is the first talk in our Artificial Intelligence and Experience series, AIEX. A few words about that project, which is a recent project. If about a third or a quarter of what we hear about the rise of artificial intelligence is true, then in the next generation it's going to revolutionize the way we work, the way we play, the way we learn, the way we fight wars, one way or another. And this, as my colleague and my friend Dan Feldman keeps reminding me, with a sliver of what's actually artificial intelligence, namely with machine learning, namely with a branch or a subset of machine learning. Did I get that right? Okay. I try. So what animates us is to try to investigate some of the social implications of this, and specifically one kind of social implications. There's a lot of questions about what this does to concerns about equity, namely does algorithmic decision-making entrench existing inequalities given what goes into the algorithms, concerns about privacy, concerns about safety that have come up with the self-driving car projects. One kind of question that hasn't been discussed at all is how artificial intelligence changes and influences how people experience themselves, how they experience their world, how they experience other people, how they experience the environment. So broadly speaking, phenomenological questions, how it changes the structure of our experience. Some of the examples that we've been playing around with for the last few months, how interacting with artificial intelligence-based applications, navigational applications like Waze, changes our orientation in space, also how it changes our sense of adventure, since nobody takes the scenic route anymore unless Waze says that it's okay to do that. How interacting with artificially intelligent digital assistants in the case of children, impact, if it impacts at all, their moral development, and so on and so forth. So our orientation with this project is specifically not normative, specifically not policy-based, not because it's not important, it is. Those questions matter, but they're being studied well by other people, and these questions at the nexus of technology and experience are not. So that's our niche, as it were. The different parts of this project are going to include a speaker series, of which Christoffer and Benedikte are our first guests, 2 small workshops or mini conferences at the end of each of the next 2 academic years, an essay competition. So for all of you faculty members here, please consider participating in it, because if you win, you will get a teaching load reduction, which is a good prize. You'll teach one semester, you'll teach one course less. And what else did I want to say? Well, let me look at my non-intelligent computer here. So before I introduce our speakers, let me ask you to come talk with me or with Dan, or email us if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, if you have ideas on who else you'd like to see on campus. The project is supported by a generous anonymous gift, and we'd like to use the 2 years that we have of doing exciting work to bootstrap it, as you guys say in the technology industry, to a larger and longer lasting project. So with that, I'd like to turn to introduce Benedikte and Christoffer, our speakers for today. We'll talk about artificial intelligence and digital play or video games. A few words about Benedikte and Christoffer. Benedikte is a game developer who specializes in applied games and games for impact. She's a co-founder of the game studio Duck and Cover Games and the artificial intelligence startup Model AI. In addition to working as a professional game developer, she takes a keen interest and critical stance towards how automation and algorithms impact people and society. And Christoffer is an assistant professor at Northeastern University College of Art, Media, and Design. He's a co-founder of Model AI with Benedikte and a co-owner of award-winning independent game studio Gute Fabrik. His work and research focuses on using AI to create, predict actions and responses in digital games. So, Benedikte and Christoffer, thank you very much for coming, and welcome.
Thank you. Oh, I don't need that. I'm wired up.
Oh, you wired up?
Yeah. So we're going to talk about how AI shapes digital play. I'm just going to introduce the picture in the background in case you don't know. This is from the game EVE Online, which is a massive multiplayer tactical space game. And I just put it there because I really think it's pretty. So I was going to say who we are, but I guess we've kind of been introduced. I'll just quickly say that I originally have a background in architecture, and then I've studied games on top of that, and as mentioned, worked with applied games for NGOs and governmental institutions. And now I'm recently working with AI tools for game designers.
All right, yeah, and thank you so much for the introduction, Neer, and for having us here. And yeah, in my case, I hark out of psychology originally, but drifted into game design and eventually artificial intelligence. So that's where I'm coming from. These days, my research mostly focuses on how can we build tools that leverage AI to help designers create what they want. So not necessarily replace them. I don't think I really believe in that, but to build tools that can support and augment creativity. And specifically what I focus on is building sort of AI copies of human players and using them to test what people would do in games and sort of like predict different kinds of actions. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later today in the talk.
Okay. The world's shortest agenda for what we're going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about who plays and why they play, and have a couple of examples of that. And then Christoffer is going to talk about AI in games, specifically what is it used for these days. Ooh, that jumped on my screen. It didn't jump here. And then we're going to end off with talking about some of the ethical challenges that we see in using AI in games. So first off, who actually plays video games? Well, Tony's mom does. I put this tweet on because Tony's mom plays apparently the casual tile matching game called Candy Crush. And she does not really play it casually, clearly. She has finished all of the levels of Candy Crush, which is quite impressive. And her son is now bragging about her abilities in Candy Crush online. So now, though Tony's mom might play, she is hardly the image is what most of us think of when we talk about or think about video gamers. I did a quick, totally non-scientific image search for the term video game player, and this is what comes up. And I think the result for this search reflects quite well sort of a knee-jerk reaction to what we think when we talk about who plays digitally. So this game is, these images are, of course, mainly of males and also young males. And apparently it's sort of slightly aggressive or very enthusiastic about playing. There are a few girls in the pictures, but not many. However, as most of you may already know, this is actually not a very, that image search doesn't actually reflect reality. The average American gamer is 34 years old, and actually 45% of gamers are women. And according to studies, 60% of Americans play daily. So if you're not one of those, then you're in the minority. And actually, adult female gamers make up a larger portion of video game players than boys under 18, 33% against 17%. So the image before was not very accurate. Yeah. So why do we play? what kind of functions do digital play fill in our lives? So the background picture here is shows Uncle Pokemon. I'm just going to introduce it because I think it's a fun picture. This is a Taiwan grandfather who got introduced to the location-based augmented reality game, Pokemon Go, which has been a lot in the media, and apparently got so enthusiastic about it that he mounted 11 phones, mobile phones, on his bike and now tours around the city of New Taipei playing at night. It's pretty committed. So obviously, the first answer to why we play is because it's fun. We do it to entertain ourselves. We do it to feel a sense of accomplishment when we complete challenges that games put before us. And we also do it to take a break in the fantasy universes that the digital realm affords us. We also do it to socialize. Many report that they play games to hang out with their friends, or as the grandfather we saw before, he started out playing with his family. We do it to meet others, and sociologists have documented how games have become a platform where people actually form pretty deep relationships with, and meaningful relationships with people they don't necessarily know in any other way than online, and people they wouldn't otherwise have met. So it's very much a social space. And it's also a digital space where people express themselves, where people play with identity. A lot of game platforms allow people to build things, to show and share with others. The picture on the side is from, well, a digital game, but it's played in I don't know, non-online game, Joust, which is a physical game. We also play as part of work. Esports, while some of us, we play to entertain ourselves, it's actually become so popular to watch other people play that for some people, playing games is a way of working. They earn a living doing so. And yeah, so picture on the side is from Dota event, Dota 2 event, where you can see this is like a huge, I think there are like 50,000 people in the audience watching these games compete in this tactical, I would say, game to see who wins. And these people win huge prizes. I think the latest tournament, the prize for the winning teams was $11 million or something like that. So this is huge. We're also seeing that colleges and universities are starting varsity teams in esports. So this is also a big business. As part of work, people are also starting to use games within job training. So simulations, yeah, basically doing what you do in the real world, but doing it in digital to train what you do. People also play to get healthy. Physical rehabilitation uses games as motivation for exercise. This is a military facility where they're using Wii Sports, I think it's called, for training balancing. And there's also a whole market of games for cognitive training, for meditation, again, also just, motivation for exercise, but also mental exercise. Studies showing that elderly improve their memory by playing some often quite trivial, actually, casual games. This is kind of in line with the work slide. People also use games now for assessment. It's used in game-based learning, where people have started to include sort of behind-the-scenes testing or assessment of students. So you're playing a game, but you're actually also being assessed while playing it. And games and simulations are also being used as psychological or skill testing in recruitment. And it's currently being, sometimes at least, being promoted as sort of a bias-free environment or way of recruiting people. Yeah, so that was a few of the examples of what games are being used in. And then
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, just a very brief primer on sort of like some of the roles that games fill in society today. So like building off of that, I wanted to speak a little bit about what AI means to games. And this is a conversation we were having over lunch, right? That what does AI actually mean these days? Is it just machine learning? Is it predictive models? Is it supervised learning? But it turns out that artificial intelligence and games, they have sort of a long storied history together. So I'm just going to cover some of the basic concepts of how AI can pertain to games. And then we're going to focus on one specific, out of a selection of concepts, I'm going to be talking about one of them specifically and how that is used to control people who play. But I just want to give you a bit of a vocabulary and a background for games and artificial intelligence. So I think the place where most people really think about artificial intelligence when they think about video games is probably in terms of what we call non-player character AI. And that's really anything that goes into the game and is perceived by the player as sort of another entity that takes actions in the game. It could be your counterpart. It could be something as basic as, you probably know, Space Invaders up here. Well, from a certain design perspective, you could consider the movement patterns of these aliens some kind of AI. And indeed, if you would ask, any player today, it's like, what's up with these like aliens up here? Well, they're the AI players. They're the enemies, right? Now, obviously, there's no real sort of like intelligent capacity there, but that's typically sort of a term that you'll meet when people are talking about AI for computer games. Beyond that, you'll also see that many games actually incorporate various systems that become much more intelligent. And the first picture here is from a virtual companion or sort of like a helper from a game called Black and White, which is all the way back from the late 90s, I believe, 1997, if I'm not mistaken. Now, your task in Black and White was to train this like companion animal to help you achieve your goals in the game. You're basically playing as a god, and this animal is sort of your helper, which is sort of put on Earth to take care of your godly responsibilities, and you train this particular creature to sort of execute your will in the world. So all the way back in 1996, this character here was controlled by a neural network and would respond and learn from the player's actions. So this is sort of a more advanced form of AI where the system is actually learning from you. But when you sort of like think about it, it's really executing the same kind of role in the game as the aliens and Space Invaders. It's providing sort of another character, a part of the scenery that's been set up for the player to interact and to play with. But it's not, in that sense, truly intelligent. It's sort of a system that responds to the actions of the players or provides part of the context for the play experience. The third place where we've seen sort of like significant development of AI in games that's maybe worth mentioning are social simulations. So I don't know how many here are familiar with the games The Sims. But if you play something like The Sims, you'll see that game really embodies a whole social simulation that sort of like models a certain normative view of what human relationships look like and how you ask how people interact, what motivates them, what they do. So that's like another place where you'll see non-player character AI have an expression that's maybe also interesting from a communicative point of view. Like what are we actually, like what sort of like judgments and messages are we sending, value messages are we sending through games through these like AI systems. But that covers what we talk about when we talk about non-player character AI. And if you want to talk more about that later, we can definitely do that, but that's not sort of the main topic today. The other term that you might be familiar with is game-playing AI, and this is where we've seen a lot of the AI work happen all the way back since the 50s, where computer scientists have been working on using AI to play. Initially, it were like simple games like NIM, then it became games like checkers. Later, they moved on to chess, where we had the situation again in the 90s, where suddenly IBM came up with a deep blue system that was capable of beating Kasparov. And I think for anyone who experienced that was sort of like a watershed moment. Because suddenly we had the first computer program that was capable of beating like a world champion in a game that humans consider significantly difficult, right? It's really not that hard to imagine that a computer could beat you at checkers, perhaps, or at noughts and crosses. But chess, everyone considered that a true intellectual challenge, and it's also a game that sort of holds a very special sort of cultural position in terms of all the things that we sort of attribute to people who are good at playing chess, right? Now, in many ways, you can say that there was nothing sort of fundamentally different about the approach that allowed IBM to build a computer that could play chess better than Kasparov, better than anyone had ever done before. But you could say that the sort of like the technological development had reached a level where we had a powerful enough system that many of the search algorithms and the search strategies that we already knew, we could apply these to a level where we could, suddenly the capacity of the machine was large enough that we could beat a human player. You may also say the same thing about Go, which is another sort of revered game that's connected to intellectual prowess and holds a very special status among board game players, often known as a very simple but incredibly hard game, the game of Go, because it only has 2.5 rules, I believe we typically say, but it takes a lifetime to master. It's a very sort of unbounded game where you have to be very anticipatory in terms of knowing what the other player is going to do. You have to constantly be sort of looking ahead, thinking out possible scenarios, and at the same time thinking very holistically about the board in the game of Go. You can't really just look at any specific part of the board. You have to take the whole thing into account when you're doing your decision making. Now, what we saw in recent years with first the program AlphaGo by DeepMind and Google, and then later the program called AlphaZero, was that we saw again that we had sort of like the technical capacity, this time through things like deep neural networks and sort of probabilistic tree search methodologies, we could suddenly beat human players because again sort of the capacity of the AI system had risen to a level where we could outperform humans in terms of pattern recognition, in terms of how many strategies we can search through, in terms of how much information the computer can remember. But again, there's really nothing fundamentally different in terms of what AlphaGo and AlphaZero, what these systems do in terms of the theories behind them, compared to what people were thinking about and capable of doing, say, in the 50s, which is typically thought of as the beginning of sort of computational game AI. Whereas there's not that much new under the sun at the very fundamental level, but the way that it scales with the resources that we have available today completely changes everything, and the way that researchers are putting this together for efficiency changes everything. That provides like these like powers of scale that we've never seen before. And most recently, we've moved on to even harder games than board games like chess and Go. What you're seeing up here is the Dota game. So again, the tournament that Benedikte was talking about, where you're seeing 50,000 people observing a few people playing this strategic video game. Well, the game of Dota here is considered even harder than chess and Go for a computer to play, simply because these games embody some of the things that humans are very, very good at. It doesn't depend only on looking ahead, on having good pattern recognition, on being able to be very analytical, and keeping that in your working memory. Games like Dota also depend on you being able to do sort of like wide pattern recognition and apply heuristics and think about many, many branching scenarios within just a few seconds and responding to it. So the interesting thing is that we've actually, in many ways, we've been fighting the computers in game playing AI in their own domain, because both chess and Go represent problems that computers are very well designed for, basically, that match the hardware and capabilities of computers very well. And that's also why these games have been beaten first. But in the case of these like real-time strategy games that we're seeing now, we're sort of moving the computer into our territory, and we're starting to have them play games that humans are sort of intrinsically good at, whereas computers have an intrinsically hard time playing these games. That's another thing we can talk more about later during Q&A if you're interested. Another place where you'll see people using artificial intelligence with games today is in AI-assisted design. This is where I do a lot of my own work. I won't speak too much about this, but obviously as computers are becoming better at retaining information, as we have better search strategies, as we have better pattern recognition, as we can start predicting different things, it becomes a natural development that you start using artificial intelligence as sort of an assistant in the game design process. And that's something that we're seeing to a larger extent in the game industry now as well. We basically often try to calculate different functional characteristics of the video game. Maybe you're building a video game level, and we'll calculate all the strategic properties of the level. We'll tell you if it's evenly balanced, if a person starting on one side of the level will have the same chance as a person starting on the other side. Or maybe we'll build copies of players and put them into the level and use that to predict how different kinds of players would play the game. Another place where you'll see artificial intelligence and games sort of like overlap. Procedural content generation is another interesting area that I think is worth knowing about if you're interested in the overlap between artificial intelligence and games. This not only applies to games, but increasingly also applies to things like Hollywood movies and all these kinds of things. But when you're playing any sort of like modern large video game today, when you're looking at things like the foliage, when you're looking at the terrain, or if it's a game that has like an infinite amount of levels, you'll basically see artificial intelligence methods being used to drive procedural content generation processes where we can generate an infinite amount of trees that all are different using sort of fractal algorithms, Nell systems, and things like that. We can just run the process from a template, but then put in random noise and get an infinite amount of content out of it. The same thing for city generation and things like that. It's a very typical application of what we would still say that this falls under artificial intelligence techniques. And this is something that's seeing heavy research interest at the moment as well. How do you make a computer intelligently produce content, maybe on its own, or maybe in collaboration with a human designer that lets you build something, that lets you build environments that are larger than what you could do on your own. You can build them faster, you can save money in your production, or you can build a product that is basically infinite. I don't know if you know this, but if you know the game Minecraft, which sort of takes place in sort of this fantasy cartoon universe where you can walk across the plains, you can cut down trees, you can build a house, you can live your life in Minecraft, basically, right? Well, Minecraft is technically only limited by the size of your computer. It's generating the terrain as you're moving into it. Nothing exists. It's void until you see it in Minecraft. It's sort of like, I'll be cautious here, but it's sort of like, maybe you'd call it solipsist game or something. The world isn't there until you perceive it. But then as soon as you turn away, it's still static, so I guess it isn't. But yeah, that's interesting. Minecraft hugely makes use of this. You'll also see that the level, like the size of your save game on your hard drive in Minecraft, it'll grow in size like proportional to how much of the world you've explored. So that's kind of funny. A final area that's worth knowing about is game analytics, before we jump into player modeling, which is what I'll be talking extensively about. But game analytics, and this is something that's worth knowing about, as anyone who plays a video game, is basically a name for a term for the process of collecting data from instrumented games as you're using them. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but you probably are. Like any piece of software that you're using on your computer will typically be logging what you do, unless you tell it not to. Most pieces of software, they'll ask you as you install a piece of software on your computer, it'll say, "Oh, would you like to help make Microsoft Office better? Like if your program crashes, would you help us make the program better?" And what you're really signing up for in that particular instance is that you're saying, yes, you can monitor how I'm using this program, anonymize this data, and send it back to the producer. And of course, in this case, Microsoft wants to use this data to make the program better. They'll analyze what happened on your computer when it crashed. I can't say for sure if they'll also look at usage frequencies of the various interface buttons and things like that. But you're basically sending some information about your behavior in this program to them, right? Now, the same thing is, of course, done in video games, in commercial products like video games, and you'll be accepting sort of a blanket permission to that when you're installing, when you're sort of accepting the software that goes on your phone, or it'll be hidden somewhere in the application, but you're giving your consent to this. But it's highly standardized and it's highly unproblematic for game developers today to put in small event indicators anywhere in a game that they're building. And that will allow them to know how often do you open the game. If you give the permission, less frequently today, but if you give the permission, where were you when you opened it? What's your time zone? What time of day did you open it? How long did you have it open for? Which level did you make it to? Do you prefer the red apples or the yellow apples? Where do you spend your time in the game? All of these data points are typically aggregated, and then they're sent back to what we call game analytics servers, where they're stored. Now, on these servers, this information is typically combined with other background information that we might have access to from other games or from other online services. And depending on whether we're in Europe or we're in the US or if we're somewhere completely different, there might be different kinds of legislation sort of limiting this kind of data aggregation and this kind of data use. But as a rule, you should really just assume that you're being observed as you're playing a game or as you're using any kind of app on your phone. It's partially anonymous. Like typically people are capable of coupling everything back to your device, but they might not be able to couple it back to who you are. Sort of, they won't be able to get your username. They're not allowed to get that. But they get a unique identifier for either the app on your phone or for the phone itself. That also depends a little bit upon the configuration. But when we're talking about game analytics, we're talking about standard practices for pulling this back into a database and then allowing the people who are developing these products, the people who are managing over these products over their life cycle, to basically inspect that data, understand who's responding to our product, and then adapt the product in response to that. It's typically also something that you'll use to do A/B testing. So you will take out and select sort of a subset of the people using your app. And remember, especially if we're talking about mobile phone games that are often free, you might have millions of players around the world, right? So you select maybe a few thousand of these and you subject them to a different version. You do what's called an A/B test, and you use something like a game analytics solution to get the data back in and compare it. And that in turn allows you to make product decisions in order to know, well, people in North America, they prefer the red version of this game, whereas people in Europe, they prefer the green version maybe. Okay, great. That's really useful product development information. None of this is technically AI, I would say. This is just like big data. This is collecting usage data about your application. But it turns out that the information that you get using these methods can also be used for what I would determine or call actual AI in game design and development. So once we take the information that we get from from game analytics and we start doing sort of analysis not at the aggregate level, but we start doing analysis at the individual level, we get into sort of an aspect of game development that's called player modeling. And that's really sort of like using different kinds of artificial intelligence or machine learning, other kinds of algorithms to predict the potential actions of your players and understanding what they would do in your game. And use that either, of course, as sort of a test thing, as something that you use to optimize your product in aggregate before you send up the next version. But increasingly, what we're seeing is that people are using these techniques to adapt the game on the fly to the person as they're playing the game. Because listen, if I know that you prefer the red apple, but Dan, you prefer the yellow one, why should I make just one version of my game when it is trivial to make a version of the game that sort of like monitors your play and decides like what version of the apple that you get? Also, maybe I can update this machine learning model over time. So if your preference changes, it would be silly of me not to change the content of the game sort of like correspondingly to that, right? And that's increasingly what we're seeing happening in the game industry today. We're sort of like building solutions that automatically figure out the preferences of the individual user, and then the game updates itself to incorporate that. And the reason that this is even possible is, of course, that games are intensely behavioral and psychological environments. It turns out, if you're looking at the research in game studies, there is a plethora of information that you can gather about a person just by looking at their behavior in video games. In fact, some recent publications are suggesting that you can infer things like life motivations and personality types on top of the things that we already knew that you could get from games, such as like your age or your IQ as it's measured by IQ tests. Maybe I won't get into the whole discussion about the IQ concept, but at least you can find things that, or we can later, but not now. But you can measure indicators that correlate with those numbers at least. Let's put it that way. So there's a lot of information about the individual that you can garner from their behavior in a video game, and especially the more complex the video game is, well, the more information you can gather about them, right? Because games are intensely data-generating systems as well. If you're looking at something like this is a typical heat map. So this is a level from a video game. And on top of this level, you can see basically every event that a number of players experience through their courses through this virtual environment. And again, this is not a research project. This is standard practice in the game industry today, that you're collecting the amount of data that will allow you to produce heat maps like this, completely standard. So what can we predict using analytics and player modeling? I just put a small list up here. I think we covered most of it already. You'll see that most of the research goes into the direction that we're trying to figure out, like, what are you going to play? What are you going to want to play? How long are you going to play? When will you stop playing? How can we keep you playing? What kind of interventions can we do? What will you buy? What should we show you? How much will we buy? How do we make you buy more? Or how do we give you another game that you will like better, so you can buy things in there. But you can also use it to predict perhaps more interesting things, such as how will you behave towards other players, and again, these sort of like more research-oriented things that you can extract from people's behavior inside games. But sort of the point that I just want to bring here is that you have a large capacity to say something about a player by observing their behavior in their playtime, right? You're actually seeing a person I mean, it's a structured environment that you're seeing them move and operate and play in, but you're sort of seeing the individual express themselves through their play when they're playing any kind of video game. And because it's digital, you have the capacity to record that. And that's very sort of like expressive and meaningful data. So having said that, I'll hand it over to you to say something about the problems with that, right? Because
Yeah. So the following slides, I'm going to introduce some of the areas that player modeling and profiling might be problematic or affect the player. So first of all, historically, people have viewed games as sort of magic circles where the notion is that the play space is something separate from real life. And as I just mentioned in the beginning, people are using games in multiple ways, and it's and so sort of the magical circle is broken. Sorry, I completely blanked out. Like a number of researchers are showing how games affect people's life. And also outside of the games, right? So you have friendships within your games. Games decide who you meet, who you may end up with in marriage later on. They might decide whether you get a job or not. It might have an effect on your health, on your mental health. Or how you spend your money. People are spending an enormous amount of time investing money as well into games, and they may be sort of tricked by the AI into doing so. So the circle is broken, and in that sense, it makes sense to discuss ethics in relation to designing games. So how can we talk about ethical AIs? So I'm not versed in ethics, but I'm going to draw upon Bostrom and Jakowski, who set a set of they list a number of virtues for AIs, and particularly AI that work within a social context. So the first one they talk about is responsibility. And that's the idea that once we start to delegate decision-making into AIs, we can't necessarily just wash our hands and claim that the algorithm did it. We also have to assign responsibility to the ones who actually designed the algorithm or the actions taken by the system. The other one they talk about is transparency. And this is that we should be able to communicate when and why actions are taken by the system. It should be transparent to the users that AI is being used. And the third one they talk about is auditability. And this is the idea of having mechanisms in place that ensures that the system actually works as intended. And so if you say this game is going to decide bias-free whether or not you are appropriate for this job, whether you have the skill set required to take this job, then you should actually be able to see and check that the system actually is acting as intended. And so some say, well, it should be open to inspection. And of course, with games, this is problematic. This is proprietary products. So it could also be trusted professionals who inspect or audit these systems. Then there's the idea of incorruptibility. It's the idea that systems should be robust against malicious manipulation from external parties. And this is actually this is quite relevant for games, because the gaming community is often quite active in playing with the games, like testing the limits of the game space. So it's not uncommon for gamers to try and hack the game. And so to ensure that something actually is incorruptible is actually quite difficult. And then there's the idea of predictability, that the outcome of the system should always be the same. Similar actions should actually afford similar outcome over time. Yeah. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different places also that AI is used, again, and where some of these problems might arise. So the first one is the concept of monetization and turn prediction. And this relates to very much to the analytics side, right? This is where you get all the data from the players of what they're doing, and you try to figure out, how do I get more money out of them? How do I predict what they're spending their money on? How do I present the right items that they want to buy? Again, someone might want to buy the red apple and not the green apple, so I should be presenting them with the green apple at the right time. Yeah. And churn prediction, that deals with I have a game that plays for a very long time. I want to keep players involved in the game space. And I want to figure out when might they actually leave the game. That's the moment of churn. What? So can I make some interventions at that point to make them stay engaged in the game? So of course, obviously, there's a problem of transparency. This is not in the interest of the industry to make it transparent that you're actually tricking people, you're showing people the goods at exactly the right point where they might be susceptible to buying something, right? So there's a conflict of what the player is interested in and what the industry might be interested in, which makes it difficult to address the ethical issues in this. So should we be informing the player that when and why AIs are used in the system? Exactly, because it links directly to the revenue stream of the industry. So I would say there's a need for regulation, which there also is coming anyway. Another area is banning. So automatic or semi-automatic banning is also an area where AI has an impact. As mentioned, games are like these social arenas where people invest significant time. They've spent money. So being excluded from a game would nullify all this investment, both socially and financially. And so in this case, you could say that the companies and the players' interest might align. Companies would be interested in avoiding mistakes where they accidentally or ban someone from a game over who shouldn't be banned. So typically some banning could be that they have systems that monitor what are you saying in the chat. Are you performing behavior within the game that seem like, for instance, you might be trying to hack the system or harass other players? And this might generate like automatic banning. So of course, you can behave within a game that's you're actually not doing anything negative. They might be in the chat, like language-wise, you're saying something which the algorithm is interpreting as antagonistic towards someone, but it's an internal joke. The system doesn't get this and might ban you and throw you off. So in this sense, you can see that gamers, again, responsibility should be clear around this, transparency. And in this part, games are actually trying to be somewhat transparent in communicating what are the rule sets for behavior within the game. What do we not allow? What do we not want? So in a sense, to some extent, some of these things are already enacted. You can contact the game maybe if you're thrown off and be told what happened and be reinstated into the game. Yeah. So next up, recommender systems. I don't know if you want to.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can. So this is sort of like what I was talking about before. But one of the interesting things about using the way that player modeling is used in the games industry today is that it'll be using most commercial game platforms and stores use recommender systems to personalize the experience of the store. So when I log into a game store, I'll see something different from you, for instance. Or when I'm inside a game and I'm offered different aspects of the game, I'll also see different things from the other players. It's all going to be completely sort of adapted to my inferred preferences, right? The system will predict what I would like to see, and I'll get the same thing. It's really the same thing as going to Amazon and you shop for one pair of shoes. Now you see a bunch of shoes there. But the interesting thing is that games are cultural products, right? And they provide play experiences to people, and they provide sort of different artistic experiences, and they communicate different values. And having a system that's trying to predict what you want to see, and actually decides what kind of this large part of culture, what pockets of it you get to see, is quite interesting, right? Because I need to take a more sort of active stance toward games as a consumer product or as an experience if I want to see the full gamut of what do video games look like today. When I need to choose my experience, somebody's already made that decision for me. Maybe not that different from what happens in other kinds of shopping, but it's definitely interesting that in games it's directly embedded into many of the experiences. The other thing is that of course, there are different things that can be derived from your purchases as well in games, and it's already been shown that we can learn a lot about the user just by looking at what did they decide to spend in the game, with what frequency, and things like that. Maybe we should. Oh, should I grab the mouse? Sorry, I wanted to go on to the next one. Yeah.
Oh, I can do it.
Oh, thank you. Oh. Now the second thing is that might be interesting from a. And this actually relates a little bit to game playing AI that I spoke about before, is generative player models. So what is a generative player model? A generative player model is a game playing agent. So it's a game playing AI that represents a player. So it can generate the actions that we think the player would produce, okay? So you can sort of think of these as a procedural counterpart to a photo or sort of a video recording of the person or an audio recording. But instead of hearing the sound of their voice or looking at their image, you're seeing what they would do in a video game. And there are a number of interesting things to discuss here, like is the representation accurate? Is this thing really representing me when other people are seeing it in the video game? Who owns this copy of me that lives on a server somewhere? And this may all sound a little bit like science fiction, but the picture on the left is from a game called Forza Motorsport by Microsoft, and they've had this feature in the game for the last 4 generations. So if you're my friend when you're playing on the Xbox and you want to play against Christoffer, but Christoffer isn't online, well, you can just download the copy of my drivatar that lives on Microsoft servers, and you can play against that. One particular interesting sort of anecdote about this was a gentleman, I think in his late 20s or 30s, His father died, and he used to play this game with his father, this driving game. They used to enjoy that on the weekends, and they, Microsoft retained the drivatar on the server, so this became an opportunity for him to sort of reminisce and relive these situations that they had together, because he would see the system playing in the way he could recognize the playing style of his father. But that only stays up there until Microsoft shuts the servers off, right? How do you get a copy of that? You can't run that system on your own. There are a number of interesting consequences of putting access to that experience in the hands of a corporation. Maybe it's no different from all my music being on Spotify. But thank you so much. Right, yeah, player matching. Another place where player modeling has a huge impact on what you experience in video games, and I think you alluded to that before, right? Is that many games have social features, and many games these days, the most popular games are multiplayer games, the esports games. And more than being just games where you compete or you try to kill the other player, I think it's very important to understand that they function sort of, I would think of them as sports clubhouses, right? It's places where people come together to socialize, and once you find your right group to play with, you actually get to know these people and you have fun together. Even though 90% of what people are saying in online games is terrible profanity and trash talking, people will, that's what you see, right? But actually people will often have closed chat channels where they have real meaningful conversations and they get to know people. So there's a hidden part of gamer culture that isn't sort of put forward that often. But of course, the video games these days will also try and find the most appropriate people for you to meet, right? So in a way, the AI systems that are driving these matching features are impacting your social life. You just don't know it, right? But we're going to decide who you're going to play with. So we're going to control your playtime that way. I mean, again, maybe it's not that unique to the digital sphere. Like other things in the real world would control who you got to meet and who you spent your time with. But in a situation where actually it would be sort of, there are limitless opportunities for meeting any player from anywhere in the world, yet this server will decide that it's better for the load balancing or it's better for your retention in the game that I match you up with other people that are close to you. And that's a decision you have no insight in, right? And that shapes your player experience. Can we go to the next one? Yeah, thanks. And finally, yeah, this is sort of an interesting thing is that games or in player modeling is also used for assessment today. Sometimes it's used overtly. This is from a startup called Knack. And what Knack sort of purports is that by playing these small games on their mobile platform, they will tell you, whether you should be for instance, you should be a credit review manager. Is sort of the insight you can get from playing this game. I'm not exactly sure about the validity in that. The psychologist in me has some questions, but the interesting the thing that's worth knowing about this is that games are also applied this way in schools to a larger extent. And one thing that's coming in the school system and the educational system is the idea of self-assessment, where we produce video games that you play for fun, but they are actually providing you with challenges that they think will uncover your proficiency in various academic disciplines and use that to score you. So rather than giving you a test, you'll be playing this game daily, and the system will continuously be updating a report about for instance, your capacities in math or your capacities in verbal reasoning and so on and so forth. So that's another point where we'll see sort of that you're experiencing this as a fun play activity, but actually the data stream that you're generating is being used for other purposes as well. And well, for grown-ups, that we can sort of understand that process perhaps, but it's interesting what that means in the school system.
Okay. So privacy. So as Christoffer actually already mentioned, there are quite a number of things you can derive, or people have shown that they're able to derive from game behavior, personality types. There's a study of, I cannot remember which game it is, so I'm not going to say, Minecraft, that linked to some of the personality types that we use in these commercial personality tests. And life motivation, you can obviously figure out people's age. They normally actually disclose that themselves, or nationality. And again, you obviously know that people can figure out your name or your nationality, not your name, but your age and your nationality, but you're probably not aware that they might be looking at who you are as a person. And that becomes interesting once, do you own this data? Would someone sell data about you to others, and are you allowed to opt out of these kinds of things? Now, when we talk about player modeling, we talked about like, oh, we can make a copy of who you are, and we can make you play, and we can figure out what you want to play. But what's also interesting with these things is, of course, what if we get it wrong? We're basically making stereotypes of who you are. And you might not be interested in being boxed in as you like red apples, you play aggressively, this is who you are. You would be a brilliant, what was it? Not data broker, but you might not be interested in sharing that stereotype of who you are. It might also be completely inaccurate. There might be mistakes in the model of you, and these mistakes actually affect, again, who are you playing with? If you don't fit the mold of the system that generates your personality model, again, you might be like put in the wrong box, or you might not be introduced to the people you'd like to meet. Nobody really likes to be stereotypes, and it is basically what some of these systems are doing, without giving you the option of necessarily opting out or deciding who this information is shared with. So there are some serious privacy concerns. And of course, this differs from where we are in the world, what kind of implications this has. The European Union has implemented rules for how data about you can be shared, but I know that this is not actually accurate here, for instance. This could be shared with others. And game companies, they actually sit on a large amount of data about how people are. And well, we don't know necessarily what they're going to do with this, and is this being aggregated with other data from other places? Yeah. So a quick summary of some of the things we've talked about. So first of all, most of us play. If you're sitting here and thinking you're not a player, well, then either you're a minority or you're actually not right, because you're just not thinking of all the different ways that you use digital products. Most of us in some way interact with interactive digital cultural products. And as we've said many times now, artificial intelligence is being applied in the social aspects of play. And player modeling and analytics does have useful applications. Clearly, I mean, we wouldn't be making it if it wasn't useful, and some of it is strictly useful for the industry, but part of it is also actually useful for the player. If you get the right match in the game, you have a great playing experience. If you get to play, as I often am not that good at playing games, but I'm playing with someone who's very good, but the game, for instance, has dynamic difficulty adjustment, then I actually have a good experience. I feel like I'm almost there. I can almost beat Christoffer, even though I am way worse than him. So I get a good experience from using some of these tools. But of course, there is a downside to it. It does create some ethical challenges. And then it comes to this. So usually, we've been saying, oh, transparency. People should know that this is going on. You should know that people are using your data. But really, I'm not sure I want to know that I'm that bad a player. It's kind of nice that it's hidden from me. It's part of, again, the circle, the magical circle, that I have a nice experience in the game because of all this magic that happens behind the scene. If you show me all the tricks, maybe it's not going to be that fun. So there is a little bit of a different balance in terms of other applications of AI when you look at games, because it is an entertainment as well. And you're interested in keeping some of the secrets sometimes. But again, yeah, it does have consequences in some cases from your out-of-game experience. So living up to some of these criteria that Bostrom and Yukowski set up might actually ruin the illusion of games and ruin the game for us. So there is a balancing act in talking about these things. So what are some of the first steps that we could look at for a more ethical application of AI in the social space? So this is very much a list for sort of the developer. Like, one should consider the worst case scenario of the AIs that we are thinking of implementing. Like, what are the outliers that might be affected of this? Who do not fit our mold, and thus we are not creating any game content for them, for instance, because, well, you don't seem like you're interested. We're not actually going to try to keep you in the game. We don't think you're going to earn us money, so you're going to get kicked out. And another way of doing it is also quite basically, increase the diversity of who is researching and implementing the games. The game industry, particularly the US, I think is quite well known for being slighted towards, whereas the players might not be young males, the game industry is still looking quite white and male, to be honest. And you might have a group of people working on your game who are simply not, don't have the life experiences to think of some of these outlier cases that they might encounter. It's not within their imagination. So another part, if you can't figure out to make your teams diverse, is look at your player base, reach out to them. Conduct user-centered and participatory design into your games. I really shouldn't look at my slides. And then of course make the models transparent, try to communicate, but again, this has a flip side that you might actually be destroying the experience. And then again, most of these games that we talk about are games that are being constantly developed. Like, once you launch a game, that's not the end of it. That's just the start of the rest of the development cycle for the game. So you will have to continuously audit the models that are functioning within your system. Are they still representative of the audience that they are providing an experience for? Or do we need to adjust this? Are there cases that are falling out? Are people being mischaracterized and mismatched? And are there things we should change? So simply continuously not only create new content for your game, but also look at some of the more sort of underlying systems that they might actually have biases that you need to account for and adjust. And then what can players do? Because the slide before was more to what can developers do? As a developer, that's kind of the way I'm thinking. But of course, players could also do something. And the first and the most obvious thing is trying to educate themselves about what games do to them. Try to understand how it affects their lives. What kind of function does it have in their lives? And try to, investigate, And then, of course, there's also the thing where you could lobby actively against some of the more problematic aspects of AI in games. The picture on the side here is from Overwatch. And it shows the content of a loot box. And loot boxes they're sort of treasure troves that seemingly random appear within games and reward the gamer with in-game contents or in-game currency to keep the player engaged in playing. It's one of those mechanisms used in churn prediction when you see that, oh, someone might be leaving, I might want to reward them with a big goal, whatever, to keep them in the game. But they are also, loot boxes are also an example of a place where regulators are starting to see that there are predatory practices within games. Belgium has recently classified loot boxes as gambling and are now implementing regulation for loot boxes. I think they're going to do, yeah, I can't remember what that's called, but anyway, they're looking at them as gambling devices and are prohibiting them in some way from children playing with loot boxes. So this is actually going to make an effect on many of the freemium games that people see out there. US legislators are actually also looking at this. So in Washington State and Minnesota, there are bills being proposed for characterizing this kind of mechanism as a gambling. Yeah. So that was actually the end. I don't know if you have anything you want to...
Make sure there's enough time left for some Q&A. So.
Oh yeah, sorry that took forever.
No, absolutely not. The floor is open. Any questions?
I guess so. When it comes to like Telltale games, where that company, they kind of have like a system where the game that you play, like the decisions that you make, are kind of, you know, compared to basically other people. Do you guys see a potential for that being, you know, those moral decisions that people are making, like within the game, like companies, but they even take interest in something like that? Because, like you're saying, like it tells a lot about your personality if you like are going with 65% of people who like chose to do this to a certain character, and it's like, is there potential for being able to use that to make money?
Maybe you should start by explaining what Telltale.
Oh, sure, yeah. So they, and let me know if I get it right, but the question is, there's a company called Telltale Games. They do very strongly narrative games, and they'll take existing intellectual properties, like maybe you know the TV show The Walking Dead. Do they have any original IPs? They probably do that as well. But it's sort of like a choose-your-own-adventure book, but an interactive one with gorgeous art, and it's really good storytelling. But again, sort of like they also, where a lot of the choices are moral choices, or you have to really, your choices have a strong impact on the story. And the question is like, would that kind of, would player modeling find use there? And would people be interested in leveraging that data? I think in the case of something like the Telltale games, and I have no idea about this, it's just a guess. I don't think I think it's so specific to those games. I mean, if you want to do a research study, I think you could use that to extract information about the players. But a game like, games like the Telltale game ones follow sort of a very traditional approach where you sell the game up front at a premium price. So I don't think they have as much of an incentive to try and use this information to keep people in the game and to upsell them, like many of the mobile game companies do. So I would imagine that they don't, but I don't know.
Would they be interested in selling, I mean, the data to other people?
I think
I mean, that's, yeah.
you'd have to have something to correlate it up against, right? So you'd have to collect some other information about the players. I'm not saying that would be impossible if you have, especially if people are playing on something like an iPad or an iPhone. But my guess would be for specifically those games, my guess would be no. But it's more of a freemium game practice, basically.
I didn't show it as an example, but the U.S. Army has for a long time had a game called Armies of America's Armies is what it's called, which is basically a recruitment tool. It used to be like one of the really fancy, nice shooter games, but it was not even a thinly veiled front. It was a recruitment tool. And I could imagine that, I have no idea, this is me speculating. No, I have this thing. that they could be doing stuff behind the scenes, looking at how people are actually playing within the game.
It would certainly be possible, right? And if you look at America's Army, it has two sides to it. The first side is that you go through sort of a boot camp scenario, and you try all the different things that you do when you are enrolled in the army in different roles, and then eventually you start getting into the shooting part of the game. So I guess both of those could be of interest.
Because I mean, it is on the website. It's like, oh, and there's the button
Right.
for
And
joining the army.
And if you look at many of the much of the early work in using video games or simulations, as it were, for assessment, a lot of that came out of the military context, especially sort of like aviation and assessment of pilots and things like that, but also for other roles in the military. So some of the technology and some of the ideas have sort of come out of the armed forces, and I'm sure it'll go back in at some point, or there's a continuous sort of like exchange of methods between those two spaces.
So tell me if this makes sense. So from the statistics you began with, it seems like 60% of us play games. I wasn't sure if the 60% of us play them 3 hours or more a day, or if those are not.
Yeah, that varies probably. It just says daily. I know from a previous report they had a little like star that says, I think, a couple of hours a day, but they removed that in the latest report, so I actually don't know how many hours they.
So one way or another, game playing, even though if you're not in that world like we talked about over lunch, you don't hear about it much, is a pretty significant source of having experiences for a pretty significant number of us. If you layer the way the AI engines work on top of that, it seems like there's a pretty conservative bias to how you have the experiences during game playing. What I mean by that is that the system is set up to self-replicate. So if the game, to self-replicate the kind of experience that keeps you in the game or that's attractive to you. So essentially, part of what this does is for those who use it for play, it curates their experience of play so that it replicates itself in the kind of way they like to play so that they can play that way again and again and again.
Particularly, I would say, for the sort of the casual mobile market, right?
So
because there's also a genre of games where you have
right.
a storyline that you walk through, and yeah.
So I mean, one thing that's, I guess, maybe interesting to think about what the function of play is, and if it's that, to replicate your experience, or if it's to make you somehow challenge / encounter new forms of experience. If you go play pickup basketball, you don't know who you're going to play with. I mean, you know you're going to play basketball, but you don't know who you're going to play with. And if you go pick up basketball in different parts of town, the uncertainty even grows. And the uncertainty may well be anxiety-provoking, or not, but there seems to be something great about that, which is kind of lost by the curation.
Yeah, you're saying that the games are so tailored for you that they stop actually being
Games.
playful.
Right.
Because
So-
it's just.
Right, that's my comment or question.
I think to some agree, some games might actually be considered. They're just time. Yeah, yeah. Oh, you go.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like with your comment from a developmental psychological perspective, right? And especially skill-based games are about sort of, well, from the skill perspective, it's about becoming better at the game. But typically, there's sort of like knock-on effects where you learn other things from that, right? There's the social aspects where the games, sort of like the basketball, connects you to people you wouldn't have met otherwise. And oh, sorry, it slipped my mind. There's a third thing that I was thinking of. Right, and there's cultural effect, right? But especially in terms of recommender systems, like once you're in one game, you'll be replicating the same experience, fair enough. But we're going to keep you in your comfort zone, so you're not really going to experience frustration. But also in terms of the stores and things like that, we're going to make sure that you experience more of the same, right? More shooters for the people who like shooters, more quirky art games for the people who like quirky art games, and never the twain shall meet. So it has like consequences like across the board like that, right?
Yeah, you end up in these bubbles where you don't actually.
Yeah.
I have no idea what happens over here, and.
It's interesting. There has been a bit of a counter movement against things like that in games. If you look up a game called Dark Souls or something called, or it's really good. But those games are mostly oriented toward making the player frustrated and making them fail. They're called masocore games, actually, also. And sort of like the thing that happens there is that people start rejecting, like they're experiencing that the games are doing this to them, and then they're rejecting them by preferring games that are very, very hard and make sort of like no concessions toward like who you are, and they don't really care. It's just a system that rejects you, and you have to sort of like work your way into it.
Yeah, so I was really interested in this idea with the magic circle.
Mhm.
Right. So, and it seemed like when you were going over like the why we play things,
Mhm.
it has a lot to do with that playground effect,
Yeah.
right? That you are in a protected environment,
Yeah.
right? And so I see what you're saying with the we don't want the illusion to be broken,
Mhm.
but if we're playing on the highway, right,
Yeah.
we want to know. Right? So
Yeah.
because it's like you could say, okay, it was more fun to play on the highway until
Yeah.
I knew I was on the highway. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
So yeah. So
um,
yeah.
but so like and I find it like in many of the examples you went over with the ethical concerns, you could sort of see, you can trace the conflict of interest,
Mhm.
right? And so you could imagine a different for-profit situation where, like you're saying, the games that you pay for up front, right, could actually regulate some kind of privacy protection so that they are a playground, right? But the games that you don't pay for, they need to monetize in a different way, and that typically involves putting you on the highway, right? And
Yeah.
having some under-the-cover story that you might actually want to know, right?
Yeah.
So like there's like I'm just thinking like transparency. All transparencies are not the same,
Yeah.
right? It's like it needs to be sort of sorted out, right?
Yeah.
And okay, I had another question, but I think I should.
I mean, there's definitely like places where it's easy to see like this is predatory behavior, like
Yeah.
this is gambling, and if there is a willingness, which it seems to regulate some of this behavior, and then other parts where you're like, maybe it's not. I mean, 2 years ago, people would say, oh, it's not so bad with all these filter bubbles. It's fine. I get the content that I want. But now people are discussing, like, okay, maybe it's problematic that I only see this version of the reality. So I don't, yeah. So I think there are
No,
definitely
but I mean,
gray
this
areas.
data
Yeah.
can be stored forever, so you can
Yeah.
only imagine what the consequences are.
Yes.
Like, so it's not about what's the consequence now.
Yeah, it's also
it's
in the
about
future.
it being there, right?
Yeah.
So like you were giving the example with the avatar of a person, right? I mean, like you could, obviously imagine, some pretty,
Yeah, that you could, yeah.
disastrous things.
And who knows like how transferable that information is, but it's a picture of that man somehow, right?
Yeah, and you are seeing data
There's
brokers
so
who are
much more
collecting from.
information in this than in that picture. Yeah. Anyway, so
Yeah, I mean the story about it's really heartfelt. I mean I think his dad died when he was 6, and he found his play traces and sort of booted them up and started playing it and could feel that his dad was present. That's like really powerful stuff.
I think it's the highway, like playing on the highway, is a great metaphor for this, and it'd be great if we could all stay in the playground. I also would like there's something about the business models of the game industry that needs to be thought about, right? And we need to see where that's headed. And of course, the games industry is, I mean, it's not a super mature industry in the fact that it only really stepped into where it is today, like in the mid 80s, right? It started in the arcades in the 70s. Then in the 80s we had home consoles. Then there was a big crash. Nintendo came back in. So around the mid 80s, it turned sort of like into the industry we know now. And then around the the early 2000s, we stepped sort of really into digital distribution, and the internet sort of like changed what games meant and how you distributed them and things like that. And one of the things that's interesting is that the game industry itself has been sort of complicit or have been working themselves in training people to pay not upfront for the product, but to pay for the experience along the way. And we're certainly not the only industry that have been part of this. You can look at something like the App Store and Apple's race to the bottom in terms of like, how do apps work? How much should I expect to pay for a working piece of software? Apparently the going rate is nothing. So how much should we expect to pay for music? $10 for all the music we want for a month. Okay, great. We should pay $10 for all the movies we want on Netflix and so on and so forth, right? And it's just that I think the game industry is slightly different in the sense that we gain more information about people and we can adapt better to the individual. And I'm not sure what the way out is here, because it's clear that all the top grossing games in the world, the games that are making the most money, most of them are freemium or they're going there. So the whole industry is headed in this direction. So even though I think the premium upfront pay for it, you get like a cultural product, like buying a DVD or something. is like it used to be basically in the games industry. It would be a very safe way of like making these cultural products. I don't think that's where it's headed.
No,
at
no,
least
without
for-
regulation, obviously the other way,
Yeah,
because like
yeah.
you were saying, like even the people that make you pay up front,
Yeah.
like of course if they can make more profit
Yeah,
on the video, why not?
yeah,
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 right.
exactly.
I feel like at the same time, like game companies like EA are like currently floundering right now because of those like microtransactions and the ability to like do the, not do premium basically. Like, I think that most players, even if they're not completely aware of like the data-driven stuff, like they're aware that they don't want to be pimped out. So I think that at the end of the day, even if the industry is going that way, people aren't going to be complicit, and they are showing that with how they're reacting to EA and other large companies like that.
Oh, sorry. And yeah, I agree. I think there's some hope in some way from the player base. So.
I have a quick question about those who make these games. It involves very great technical skill on the part of the designers to figure out how we're going to manipulate people. And a lot of those come through professional programs and train in psychology and are members of the APA, and they sign up on guidelines and principles about the treatment of people, but they're quite removed from the people that they're actually affecting. So is there any sense that they are skirting the borderlines of their own professional guidelines when they're doing that? Is there any sense of accountability for those that are involved and they're working for the man and they're trying to help them make as much as possible by using their skills at manipulating human decision making as much as possible?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So you're talking about the actual professional responsibility they have
Like
from
if
their
I'm a trained
Yeah.
PhD psychologist and I go in there and I use my skill
Yeah.
of how to manipulate people, but I'm doing it to maximize profit for this game maker.
Yeah, you are. I mean, we're seeing in also the data analytics community that people are starting to sign up to I won't be participating in this kind of thing. And you also see people who actually don't come from a professional background. Who I have friends who are like, no, I know developers like, no, I don't want to work for those kind of companies. But of course, that's a very elitist. I mean, if you're able to decide for yourself, then you might. So there's also like a backlash from developers themselves that they're not interested in participating in this.
Right. But I don't know for certain, I don't know if you know either, but I don't believe there's any like professional body regulating this within video games. And I don't think that, I've never heard about a case where an organization like the APA has followed up or somehow penalized a person for engaging in sort of like enabling these sort of like algorithms.
And they haven't penalized people for engaging in helping the US military to torture people, so they're hardly going to do it.
For this,
something
for
like
this,
Yeah.
for this.
No.
True.
But it also, I mean, these are also like
Setting the bar.
these are also like pretty big companies. I mean, you can't really pinpoint who's doing what. Like,
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
you have 20 data scientists on your
Right.
your game. Who's doing
Right.
what? These are gigantic entities.
Okay, yeah. Who's accountable?
Yeah,
for,
who's actually
for
accountable
this
here?
at the end of the day? And we train the machine learning algorithm, and it's self-updating, by the way. So we built the system, but what it does now is sort of based on individual actions, and we just turn it on and it runs. So yeah, I think I agree. That's a huge discussion that should be figured out.
Yeah, self-updating. You might. This was not what I intended it to do, but now it's like it's being fed new information, and it's. I might have said something loose that moves in a different direction than what I expected it to. So yeah.
I'm not sure if this is so much a question as a comment, and maybe it's just a thought that maybe it would help to broaden a little bit of the palette. If you're thinking about play is not just fun and socializing and work, but it's also developmental, right? There's a long tradition of thinking about play and about cultural products in general, about their actual content, how they relate to development and stuff like that. And I have a friend who said, if you want to do studies of stereotypes, you should really just look at Grand Theft Auto, right? I mean, somebody should write a really good cultural study of Grand Theft Auto. What kinds of stories are we getting? What kinds of development are we training not just kids but adults into? Is there a kind of a narrowing of not just experience but also developmental capacities, imaginative capacities in the space of play? So I'm just thinking, you know, the schema you got from, I'm forgetting the two people who had the ethical schema, are all sort of, you know, traditional sales kinds of stuff. Yeah. Like somebody's trying to sell me Cheerios, what's in that damn box, and are they really allowed to do that much? But there's something else that's going on with Cheerios, and especially with play and cultural products, that it's affecting our developmental capacities and our, the broader social scheme of what different cultural products do. So I just encourage you to broaden out the scope of the ethical questions there.
Well, I agree. I must admit, when now you said Grand Theft Auto, as an adult, I've always viewed Grand Theft Auto as satire.
Yeah.
I think it's quite clear for someone who's grown up that it's a game on satire, and the stereotypes are jokes. But if you're playing it as a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, you might not see this. Well, most likely you won't, so you're actually being presented with a kind of weird universe.
Yeah.
I mean, luckily for games, there are labeling systems sort of to... I mean, yeah, but it is a helpful way for adults also to, like, should my kid be playing this or not? But again, a lot of it is digital. Parents might not actually see what their kids are playing.
Yeah, and also I think and that's a really interesting point, right? Because with the labeling systems orient themselves, they often, you know, they more or less treat video games as though it were a cartoon or a movie, right?
Yeah.
And they don't really engage with what you do in the game. They just engage with, you know, do we have nudity and so on
Yeah,
and
it's
so
true. They don't.
Yeah.
I think we ran out of the time that we promised we'd let people go, so
Okay.
we'll continue this informally, but let's thank Christoffer and Benedikte. Thank you.